Thank you for inviting me to Berlin to speak today. Madam President, I am honored to be with you. I'd like to talk this afternoon about U.S. policy towards Iran since the 1979 revolution, and then suggest some ways in which this policy needs to be changed in the future. As a former director of policy planning at the State Department, it pains me to say that U.S. policy towards Iran for much of the past 3 decades has been marked more by failure than by success. The Iranian regime has not changed its behavior. It has not moderated its policies. Indeed, events in the past few years, even in the past few weeks, seem to indicate that it has adopted an even more extremist approach. A few weeks ago, I took a tour across the Middle East where I met with senior leaders and military officials. At the top of the agenda at every meeting was Iran, the threat it poses to stability in the region, its support for terrorism and Islamic extremism, and what might be done to halt its nuclear weapons program. We know that the Iranian regime continues to ignore UN Security Council restrictions on its nuclear program, and we have already seen indications that its behavior is prompting other countries in the Middle East to pursue their own independent nuclear options. We know that Iran is keeping open its nuclear weapons option and working each day to bring itself closer to producing nuclear weapons. Over the years, the United States has tried different approaches to the rulers in Tehran, from sanctions to containment to covert dialogue to publicly extending an open hand to Tehran. None of these approaches has worked. Let's recall that America's first real interaction with the Islamic Republic of Iran was over a hostage crisis, when U.S. diplomats were unlawfully seized and imprisoned for 444 days. Every U.S. president since Jimmy Carter has tried to improve relations with Tehran. All have failed. Why has the United States been so slow to realize that the Islamic Republic of Iran has no intention or capability of changing its behavior? Now, obviously, many factors have been involved in shaping U.S. policies over the years. The first factor has been a lack of understanding of the Iranian regime, starting from the very beginning. The United States was massively unprepared for the fall of the Shah. We still have no embassy or diplomats in Tehran. There are financial and commercial restrictions on Americans doing business with Iran. Few universities or colleges in America teach Farsi. Even fewer have exchange programs. The result is that very few people in the U.S. government understand the history, culture, and politics of Iran. Compounding all these impediments to understanding is the complex nature of the Iranian regime. Western terms like moderate or reformer take on wholly different meanings within the Iranian political context. Even an insider like Rafsanjani can wake up one morning and find himself on the outside, surely yet another sign of the regime's insecurity. In one sense, the regime looks and behaves like a traditional state, with elections, a parliament, and a president. Yet in another sense, it looks and behaves like a brutal theocracy, with oppressive security forces and a supreme leader. The truth is that increasingly, the regime resembles a dictatorship more than a democracy. A second factor is that Iran has not always been front and center in America's strategic calculations. Over the past 3 decades, American administrations of both political parties have been more preoccupied with other foreign policy challenges. During the 1980s and 1990s, it was seen as a nuisance more than as a strategic threat to America's vital national security interests. It could be deterred and contained by a relatively small commitment of military means. This judgment started to change dramatically after 9/11, when Iran's nuclear ambitions came into greater focus and when the United States became more concerned over Iran's support for terrorism. Now, more recently, the Obama administration has come to office with a new idea and a new approach to Iran. President Obama believed he could succeed where others had failed and reset relations with the mullahs in Tehran. This belief was the fourth factor explaining U.S. policy. Specifically, President Obama thought he could negotiate an end to Iran's nuclear weapons program. This meant privileging good relations with the regime over supporting the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. In other words, the Obama administration was reluctant to support the Iranian opposition for fear that it would irritate the regime and sink the nuclear talks. And the Iranian regime encouraged this thinking, warning diplomats not to meddle in domestic Iranian politics or else. As someone who has spent much of my career negotiating with bad actors from Northern Ireland to North Korea, I can assure you that empowering the Iranian opposition would increase our negotiating leverage, not decrease it. The record of U.S. diplomacy towards Iran over the past 30 years has not been very distinguished, but it is possible to learn from our previous mistakes. The past can inform U.S. policy going forward. What should the United States do now? Any U.S. policy needs to start with providing greater support for those brave opposition voices inside Iran calling for freedom and democracy. The Obama administration, all of us, should take encouragement from the events during the past few weeks and months across the Middle East. We have seen people who have been denied dignity rise up in Tunisia, in Egypt, and elsewhere to demand more representative government, more economic opportunity, and more transparency and accountability in their societies. These values are not Tunisian values, or Egyptian values, or even Arab values. They are universal values, and they are shared by the vast majority of people inside Iran. It is an uncomfortable fact that no one in the U.S. government or across the Arab world predicted what we have just seen occur across the region. No one. So although it may look like the regime in Tehran, with its repressive security forces, remains in firm control, we cannot be too sure, and neither can they. The recent events across the Middle East have demonstrated how poor we are at predicting popular uprisings. This means that the day when we see the end of the regime in Tehran may be closer than we realize. But as I said before, it is not enough to hope that this day will come. We need to work to hasten its arrival. So what can the United States do? First, the Obama administration should continue to tighten the economic noose around the regime and lobby other governments, especially in Europe, to do the same. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has stated that the sanctions are having an impact on Iran's economic behavior. Good. The administration needs to intensify its efforts. Second, the United States needs to separate its criticism of Iranian officials from the Iranian people. What I have in mind here is calibrating our official statements so that they do not inflame Iranian nationalism or allow Ahmadinejad to exploit those statements to solidify his own power. Efforts to expose corruption at the highest levels of the Iranian regime would be a good start. Third, the Obama administration needs to give its wholehearted support to the Iranian opposition. There is no reason for President Obama to be shy anymore about supporting the Iranian opposition. Finally, the United States needs to delist the MEK immediately. There is little time to spare. We all know that the people at Camp Ashraf are being harassed and psychologically intimidated daily. Just in the past few days, we've already heard and learned that the number of loudspeakers aimed at these poor people have increased. This situation will only get worse as the United States reduces its forces and prepares to leave Iraq at the end of this year. The time to help the suffering people at Camp Ashraf is now. The time to delist the MEK is now. Thank you very much.
Uns abhalten in guten und schlechten Zeiten. Zusammen sind wir wieder da. Wir können